He, who was a clergyman, kept eating people like it was breathing. He bloated like a drowned pig, became melted sludge. Man, what a visceral, stomach-churning image, right? That quote comes from Hawkwood, and it perfectly captures the absolute rot at the heart of one of the most prominent religious institutions in this whole dark fantasy universe. We're looking at a faith that literally started with holy light and divine purpose, only to devolve into a sludge-filled cult of cannibalism and stagnant darkness. It is absolutely wild.
Welcome back to The Explainer. Okay, let's dive into this. Today, we're taking a structured, chronological look at the tragic decay of the Way of White. We're going to trace the exact path this religious order took, mapping out how an institution that was built to protect humanity ended up plunging it into the darkest depths imaginable. I am so excited to guide you through this, because when you lay the history out from start to finish, the sheer scale of the church's corruption is just staggering.
Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the foundation of the church as a political tool in the false son of Thorolund, then look at the tragedies of pilgrimage and how they treated their own faithful. From there, we move to the corruption of the cathedral, meet Aldrich the cannibal saint, and finally, witness their ultimate endgame in the Age of Deep Seas. Let's get right to it.
Section 1. The False Son of Thorolund, Building a Fraud.
So, to really understand this rot, we actually have to start at the roots with Allfather Lloyd. He's the uncle of Lord Gwyn. Now, after Gwyn famously sacrificed himself to link the First Flame, there was this massive power vacuum among the gods. Lloyd steps in, taking power as the chief deity of the Way of White Covenant to maintain order and control over humanity. And we can literally see his political manipulation in the linguistic roots of their holy cities. Think about the original capital of the gods, Thorolund. It uses the Elvish word for sun, a language meant for supernatural mythical beings. But the center of Lloyd's church, Thorolund, that actually translates to sol londo in the original text, using the Latin root for sun. And Latin is the universal language of mankind. Lloyd essentially built a copycat sun city to appeal directly to humans. He legitimized his newfound power by branding his human-centric capital as the equal successor to the realm of the gods. Brilliant, right? But incredibly manipulative.
And you know, Lloyd's Sun City was built purely on oppression. The church employed these fearsome cleric knights to ruthlessly hunt down the undead. Why? Well, to prevent the prophecy of the chosen undead from coming true and threatening their grip on power. What's absolutely incredible here is how this dense lore ties directly into a literal gameplay mechanic. If you look at Lloyd's talisman, it's an item that explicitly blocks Estus recovery, meaning his holy knights were technologically equipped to neutralize the undead's only means of healing. They could hunt them with absolute impunity.
Section 2. The Tragedies of Pilgrimage, Sent to the Dark.
You see, it wasn't just the undead they hunted. Their callousness totally extended to their most devout followers too. Just look at the doomed journey of the noble maiden Rhea of Thorolund. She starts at Fireling's shrine, right? Sent on a holy pilgrimage to find the rite of kindling. But then she is callously abandoned by her veteran protector, Petrus, down in the perilous catacombs. Next thing you know, she's kicked into a pitch-black pit by Patches in the Tomb of the Giants, where her bodyguards actually go hollow. And even if you manage to rescue her and she makes it back to the undead parish, she is ultimately abducted by channelers and dragged off to a prison cell in the Duke's archives just to go completely mad.
Actually, there's a quote from Griggs of Vinheim that really hits the nail on the head here. He says, "The poor young girl sent down into a tomb. What a terrible mission she is burdened with." It highlights the sheer, unbelievable hypocrisy of the situation. The Way of White is a religion that worships light and the sun, yet they routinely send young, innocent maidens like Rhea into the absolute deepest, most dangerous darkness of the catacombs on impossible suicide missions. The church was perfectly willing to feed its own children to the dark just to preserve their sacred flames.
So, what does this all mean? The crucial question here is, what happens to this corrupt, oppressive, light-worshipping religion when the gods inevitably abandon them and the first flame begins to fade for good? Take a breath here, because this is where we plunge straight from the original lore into the absolute horrors of the sequels. This is where the church's hypocrisy finally catches up to them.
Section 3. Corruption of the Cathedral. The Holy Spring Polluted.
To answer what happens to the church, we have to travel to the Cathedral of the Deep. Now, originally, the cathedral was this beautiful, peaceful, holy site dedicated to Kytha, the goddess of tears. It was built upon a tranquil spring of holy water, and the Way of White used this location specifically to cleanse impurities from the afflicted and the undead. It was meant to be a place of healing. But look at how this definition reveals what that holy spring eventually turned into, the deep. And we need to carefully distinguish this from the traditional abyss we see earlier in the lore. The deep isn't just some limitless, devouring void. It's specifically heavy, water-like, and stagnant. It's like when souls are left in the dark for too long, the heaviest elements, the literal dregs of humanity, sink to the very bottom like sediment on a deep ocean floor, and they just stagnate.
Let's move on and see how this builds, because when the holy spring became polluted by the deep, it started manifesting these horrifying, writhing maggot monsters. Look at the visual escalation of the bishop's desperate, devolving tactics to fight off this infestation. First, they used traditional divine fire and torches. Makes sense, but when that failed, they resorted to horrific bloodletting rituals using notched whips, mistakenly believing they could bleed out the corruption. And finally, abandoning their faith entirely, they embraced the absolute taboo of dark sorcery. They literally started using the power of the deep to fight the deep. They were utterly breaking down.
Section 4. Aldrich the Cannibal Saint, the Cradle of Repulsiveness.
So how did a peaceful spring turn into a nightmare of stagnant dark and maggots? Well, the source was a single, depraved cleric from the Boreal Valley named Aldrich. Sullivan sent Aldrich to the cathedral to be cleansed of his horrific habits, but instead Aldrich's immense impurity completely broke the holy spring. He polluted it beyond repair. Now confining this monster fell to exactly 3 archbishops of the deep, MacDonald, Royce, and Clint, who were stationed at the cathedral. When the cleansing failed, these high-ranking clerics were trapped in an impossible situation. They had to contain a monster that was rapidly corrupting their holy site, all while trying to somehow keep their own minds intact.
But here's the kicker. They didn't just contain him. Under the direction of Pontiff Sullivan, they actually began to appease him. The road of sacrifices wasn't some spiritual road for holy pilgrims. It was a literal supply line. Evangelists were sent out to round up the undead and transport them in cages directly to the cathedral. And once there, enslaved giants were used to literally crush these human sacrifices into a sludgy meal to feed the ravenous man-eater. The church literally became a slaughterhouse.
And to cope with the absolute atrocity of feeding their own flock to a sludge monster, the clerics' minds simply broke. We get this chilling item description from the Deep Ring. It tells us that the church is a cradle for repulsive things, thus they needed a grand story that will drive them no more mad. The repulsiveness was so profound that the clerics had to literally rewrite their own holy scriptures. They needed a grand story to justify the horrors they were committing. They warped their entire religion to worship the deep just so they wouldn't go entirely mad from the guilt and the terror.
Section 5. The Age of Deep Seas, Devouring the Gods.
And this brings us to the climax of the story, where the corrupted church officially abandons their mission to link the first flame and completely turns their back on the old gods of Anorlando. See, Aldrich's power grew so immense from his cannibalism that he was basically forced to become a Lord of Cinder. But he ultimately refused to stay on his throne to keep the fire fading. Instead, he envisioned this terrifying new era, an age of deep seas. Basically a world completely submerged in the stagnant dark. And to cement his position as the ruler of this new age, he led his radicalized cult all the way to Irithyll with one singular, horrifying goal: to eat the last remaining old god, the dark moon deity, Gwyndolin.
And this brilliantly illustrates the total, absolute inversion of this religion. It's staggering. Think about the original way of white, defined by fire, holy light, and the deep red robe symbolizing the divine protection of the flame. Now compare that to what they devolved into, the defenders of the God-Eater, defined by water, stagnant darkness, and deep blue robes. The church entirely flipped, the whole shebang. They changed their vestments, their magic, and their gods, choosing to worship the exact repulsive entity they were originally stationed there to seal away.
We've seen how a religion of the sun was dragged down into the sludge by political hypocrisy, impossible pilgrimages, and the insatiable hunger of a cannibal saint. It's been quite a journey today, so thank you for joining me for this explainer. Looking at the trajectory of the deep, we really have to ask ourselves, if the first flame truly fades for good, will the world simply drown in this heavy, stagnant dark, or is there something even more terrifying waiting for humanity at the very bottom of the deep sea?